So welcome back again. In this lesson, we're going to talk about functions in Swift, which are a rather important topic. And although they're quite important, they're actually very simple to use in Swift. So I'm going to quickly show you what they are and what do I mean. Let's go to Xcode. And this time I'm actually going to go and make a project. So Command-Shift-N, and in here, a macOS command line tool. We make sure its language is Swift, and I'm going to call it functions in Swift. Okay, and now create. So functions like Swift are, in terms of the principle, are exactly the same thing as Objective-C and most other programming languages. They offer us a way of modularizing our code and also offer us a way to call a same piece multiple times, and they help us categorize our code. So imagine I want to make a function. In the past, if this was Objective-C, we would do something like this. We would do dash, depending on whether it is a constructor or not, and then we would say return type, and then we would say name of function, and then we would say a column, and then we would say argument type, and then we would say argument name, and then this whole thing would continue. We would have multiple arguments, multiple argument types, so on and so forth. In Swift, it's actually a lot more streamlined, and it is very much like most modern programming languages. So here is how I make a function that doesn't have any arguments, doesn't return any arguments. So I'm going to say func, my function doesn't have any arguments, doesn't return anything, and here is the body of my function. If your function doesn't return anything, that's kind of like a void function. So you could actually add a void in here if you want to, or you can just completely drop it. So this function, whenever it is called, it just does something, such as what? If I say print hello, and then somewhere in here call my function, that would print hello for me. Let's see that in practice. And that says hello. And something you probably already noticed is that unlike Objective-C that we had to say self and then self name of function and then bracket, in Swift we just call the name of the function with its arguments. In this case, there are no arguments. This is of course giving me an error simply because it's Objective-C. It doesn't work in here. So I'm going to remove that. How about we now add an argument to our function? How about we add an argument that receives a name and says hello that name? So I'm going to go in here and say, well, I have something called input name of the type string. So my function has an input name of the type string. And whenever we want to print, we say hello, and then we interpolate imp name. So whatever input name we have gotten, we say hello space imp name. So how would I call a function like this? I would simply say my function, and then it said you have to enter an imp name. I'm going to say the imp name is word. Let's run it now. Perfect. It says hello word. The hello comes from within the body of the function. The word comes from the argument. Now, what if I had multiple arguments? What if I didn't just have the imp name? Well, what if I had imp name and imp last name of the type string? Well, it would be exactly the same thing. It would be hello, whatever, say a space, and then another one, imp last name. And then in here, I had to actually enter the other piece as well. And I would say, hello world, I don't know, that's a weird last name to make right now. Hello world of iOS. Oh, good, I got there, okay. So hello world of iOS, and that would print hello world of iOS. So far we had a function that receives some argument, and it can do whatever you can imagine between them and give us a response. For instance, if you give a function that is going to multiply two numbers, it would simply be, let's say imp, my function, and then I would say imp a of the type integer and imp b of the type integer. And then I would say do this. let res to be imp a multiplied by imp b, and then say print, and in the print say res is, and then I would do one of these. What is res? Res is res. And then if I wanted to call that function, I would say my function, and it says, hey, you have to give me one guy called input a of the type integer, another guy of the type, integer by the name of input b. I'm gonna say 5 by 17. So what is 5 by 17? 85. I know it. So 5 by 7, it's 85? Yeah, it is, right? Yes, it is 85. I for a second I doubted myself. So yes, so that's how we call a function that has multiple arguments, does something, and then once it does that thing, it doesn't return anything. The return is a still void. So, but what if we wanted to actually get the return? What if we didn't want this guy to print the res? Rather than that, we wanted to see the actual res. So here's how I would do that. I would say, well, this guy now has a return type of integer, and this return type of integer has to be returned somewhere. So return res. So once again, I have a function, 2 arguments as input, 1 integer has to be the output of it or outcome of this function, and I'm gonna say do whatever you have to do mathematically or otherwise, and then return that value. So essentially, and this is a very important point, this goes to the core of programming. If you're new to programming, if you have done programming in the past, you know this very well. But if I was going to enter values such as 2 and 5, we know 2 by 5 becomes 10, right? So if I wanted to call my function here, I would say my function, and I would say values are 2 and 5, but then this is just like saying, instead of my function, in the middle of your code, you have written 10. There is really no way that this thing is actually being used right now because it returns a value. So you have to do something with it. What could you do? I don't know. You wanted to send it to be your registration for a user. You want to send it to find the value of the number of the, I don't know, listings that are associated with a certain user in a real estate application, whatever it is you are trying to do. But you shouldn't just call it in here where the return is like a numeric value, because the return of this would be 2 by 5, 10. It is as if I wrote 10 in the middle of my code, which doesn't really make any sense. What does make sense is saying this, saying print, and then in the print, I would say, let's call this function, say that is what we want. So that would be a much more acceptable formula. It would be print whatever you find in here. And if I run this now, it will give me 10, just like how we expected it to be, 10. Perfect. Or you could, in here, you could have a variable that is equal to that function. So when you're defining and declaring your functions, you should have a clear plan for what is the arguments that you're entering into them and what are you getting from them and why do they matter for whatever reason. For instance, I could give you an example. Imagine your function was meant to remove the characters that you don't want. For instance, you wanted to get a string and give us back a clean string. So I would say this is an input string, and then the return is a string. And then in here, I don't know how, but you would do this. You would say var res string, and that would be empty at the beginning. And then we would do some cleaning, and then we would return res string. So what is happening in here is that when we call our function, input a string of the type string, of course, when we call our function and we give it a string, it cleans it up and gives it back to us. And then maybe, just maybe, if you remember from some of our previous lessons, this was the string you wanted to pass to the next view controller, for instance. So something like that would be acceptable. Maybe you have a or let's call it next view controller, and the next view controller has a received data that would become my function, and then my function would have an imp string. I'm writing this in a comments because this just doesn't make any sense. I don't have an next view controller. This is just for the sake of demonstration essentially. So my imp string would be like, I don't know, my text fld.text. So it is values that I don't know if they're clean or not, and then I would send it to this my function. He would do some cleaning, he would return a good one, clean one to me, and I would push the clean one into the received data of my next view controller, or something to that effect. So far we saw functions that they can accept arguments, they can return values, or they could have neither of those two. But what if I wanted to have a function that returns more than one value? What if the situation that I had was this? I wanted my function to receive a value and let me know whether the value that it has received, whether it was a positive or a negative value, and also return the positive version no matter what. So essentially, here is what my function should do. If I give it -5, it has to get back to me with 5 and false, saying the positive version of this is 5 and it wasn't positive on its own. And if I gave it 17, it should give me back 17 and saying true. So I want some sort of a structure that allows me to return more than one variable. And that is something we saw recently in our previous lesson, if I'm not wrong, and that's a tuple. So let's see how we could rewrite this entire thing. So func determine int input integer if is of the type integer, and I have a return which is an integer and a boolean. Now let's see what we have to do. It's very simple. So if input integer was larger than -1, then I have to have a variable called res boolean that's going to be by default I'm going to set that to be true, and then I'm going to say if it is larger than that, don't do anything. So if it is smaller than 0, res boolean has to become false. That's one part of it. I also need the return value. So I'm going to say var res integer is by default going to be input int. And then if it is below 0, get res integer multiplied by -1. So change its signature. Once you're done and through with that, say return. What do I want to return? I want to return the res integer and I want to return the res boolean. So imagine if a number such as 5 goes through this thing. It says, well, is 5 smaller than 0? That's not happening. So 5, res boolean is going to be true and res integer is going to be 5. So let's test this out. I'm going to say I have a let my int being -5, and I'm going to have to say I have a let state is going to be, what is it going to be? Is going to be determine input value, and the input value is going to be my int dot 1, the boolean one. So that's the state, and then let pos number, the positive value of here is determine int, and then again dot 0. So I find the state of it if it is -5, and I find out the positive value of it, whether it was -5 it becomes 5, if it is 5 it still stays 5. Then I would say print, and here's what I want to print. I want to say the number that I had, which is my int, was, what was it? It was the state, and is now, let's find another one. I know this is really a very crude version of doing this thing, but you understand the concept behind it, I hope. So let's see what we get. So if I run this, it's gonna tell me -5 was false and is now 5. And if it was 17, it says, what does it say? 17 was true and is now 17. Perfect. So again, I managed to get 2 values out of a function. You could also call these ones. You could call this one unsigned num, or whatever you like to, and then this one, call it a status. So just like a tuple that we could call its values or variables, you could also do it here. And if you had those, you could essentially go in here and say, well, that one is that, and this one is the status. You don't need to rely on the indexes. You can rely on the actual names, and that would perfectly work the way you expected it. Before I finish this lesson, I want to show you one more thing about functions in Swift, which is again a unique thing to Swift, and that is functions that are nested inside each other. So I could have a function called func1, and doesn't have any arguments, doesn't have any return, even though they don't really matter. And inside that, I could have another function, call it nested1, or anything that you want to call it. And then the inside one maybe does something. For instance, it says this is printed from inside. All right, so I have a function that is nested inside this one, and since it is nested inside function one, I can actually say nested one, or nested func, let's call it nested function. So now I have a function which is nested inside another one, and I can call it in here. It is primarily used if you have a very long function and for some reason parts of it, they can be categorized, but you don't want to expose them outside your function. You only want to keep them inside. To be very honest with you, I don't really use this very often. I can say that throughout the years, maybe I've used it a handful of times. So don't worry overly about, what it is and how it works. It's obviously best if you learn everything and you know that they exist, but you have to craft your own way of doing things. And every once in a while, look up online and look at other people's code and try to get a sense of, how they are doing things, if their way is better. Now, we need a way to call these functions. And of course, we can't call this one because that one is not even accessible. We don't have access to that guy. Only these guys have. So we can call func1. And if we do that and we run this code, now it says this is printed from inside. So that's about that. We talked about functions that they have no arguments. We talked about functions that they have some arguments. We talked about functions that they had no return types, they were voids, or the ones that they were actually returning something. And of course, if they are returning, there has to be a return before them. Something has to come out. We talked about functions that they return tuples instead of single values. They return multiple values. And if that's the case, again, we have to return a similar item. We can't really, ignore any of them. And we finally talked about having nested functions. And in here, I have an error, and that's because of this, because of that. And then in here, argument, I'm going to say nil. I don't want to, imp arg anything to it. So that's about that. That's about functions. Let's move on to our next lesson.